Hello. Today I'm going to be trying to determine immigrant and refugee acceptance rates through local library cookbook collections. I'm going to be using community infographics to try to accomplish this. What is community infographics? So, as defined by Michael Gerstein, community infographics is an interdisciplinary field that is concerned with using information and communication technologies to empower members of communities and support their social, cultural, and economic development. My personal interpretation of community infographics when I first read this was that it's open source intelligence for those that want a long walk for a short glass of water. So, my hypothesis is that cookbook collections of a local library reflects if the population would be accepting of culturally diverse outsiders. I wanted to talk about the origins of this hypothesis. So, I spent several years living in a town called Wilmer, Minnesota. Now, this town was known for being extremely hostile to the Hispanic population of the town. During the time I lived there, the amount of Somali refugees had increased rather dramatically. So I was beginning to see the shift of the nature of this hatred from the Hispanic immigrants to the Somali refugees. I never understood the reason of hating people for just an accident of birth. And I've always considered that the only significant difference between people is little more than their spice palette. I also believe that a potluck does better for bringing strangers from all over the world than any conversation would. So, the politics of food is rather complicated. So, I have three quotes here on several ends of the spectrum. Our relationship with food is as varied as people in the world. We have from one end of the spectrum, which treats food as little more than fuel for our body. So they treat food as a form of cultural identity and community. And even some that food is nourishing for our very soul. The methodologies for community informatics is that I needed to collect publicly available data only. Because of the size of the scope I felt was necessary to determine the information, I needed as wide a brush as possible. And I knew from the very beginning there was two sources I was going to use outright. The first being the US 2020 census, the second, Marshall Breeding's library technology website. After that, things were a little hazier for me. I started using search results by entering in best and worst cities for refugees in America. I also ended up using a suggested search called best and worst cities for immigrants seeking U.S. citizenship. Some of the first articles I was looking at kept referring to a company called Boundless, and they talked about the best places to become a U.S. citizen. They also included some of the worst places to become a U.S. citizen. A second company called Welcome to America, a nonprofit that identifies places throughout the U.S. as highly accepting of refugees and immigrants. And one of the last items I ended up selecting was the UN M49 map. This is also known as standard country or area codes for statistical use, meaning this map was ideally suited for my intended use when it comes to analyzing search returns of the library's cookbook results. So, one of the first things I needed to approach was what the early returns were bringing me. I was receiving search results that kept mentioning naturalization rates of U.S. metropolitan areas, which made me ask, what constitutes acceptance of immigrants and refugees? Welcome to America is a nonprofit that fit half of my initial question perfectly. However, a drawback was when analyzing the search results for a list of the worst cities, it appeared to be politically motivated, as it tended to include an elected representative on either the state, local, or federal levels. And several of these results even went so far as to mentioning the race of the immigrants coming in, as well as the race of the elected officials. I ended up choosing a recent article from each to help narrow down my list. So when it came time to collect the search results, I did it for both the consortium-wide and the local or main branch. Unfortunately, 5 of the 15 layers did not give me the option to restrict to a local or main branch. Cookbooks that had a regional identifier or non-health related dietary restriction were counted. Cookbooks that had just a type of food, such as pizza or egg rolls, were not counted unless the mention of the region was also named. Cookbooks that specialized in things like vegan, vegetarian, gluten, or dairy-free were counted. Cookbooks that removed ingredients like salt, sugar, or had low cholesterol cookbooks were not included. I also included cookbooks that had a non-Christian religious element to them. And for recording nationalities and regions and continents, I opted to use the M49 map as I mentioned before. I selected this because I can go down to the individual nation as well as having trans-regional area cookbooks. I would like to note that some trans-regional cookbooks that I decided to place in very specific locales, such as Mediterranean, Arab, Mexican American, and Hawaiian. When it came time to group the libraries, I ended up opting for city population. They seem to fall into largely 3 different types: under 100,000, over 90,000, and in between that. And a quick note about Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania: it has not one but 2 public library systems. In my findings for the small library, I find that cookbooks of collection size and service population show a high percentage that ends up supporting my overall hypothesis. As we sit and look here, if we compare Wilmer and Lancaster, Pennsylvania, we can see that cookbooks as a percentage of the collection size as being 0.24% and 1.5% respectively. Although if we take this down to the local level, we see this further drops to 0.04% for Wilmer and 0.5% for Lancaster, Pennsylvania's local main branch. Also, when looking at the breakdown of the regions in which the cookbooks come from, when we look at the regions of the Americas, we see that is clearly the largest contributor, with food allergies and removals typically being second, with Europe being right behind that, although this is not always the case. The findings for the medium-sized library do align similar to that of the small libraries. When we look at Riverside and Fresno, we see the numbers are rather similar. Although when we actually look at the full collection size, we can see there's a very large discrepancy between them. If we compare the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh to Fresno, which has a similar collection and annual circulation size, we can actually see a very large difference, which favors the hypothesis. Again, looking at the cookbooks regions, we see that the America region, when looking down at the region sections, we can see that the America region again takes first place in most cases. although the food allergies and removal tends to be a lot closer to the Americas returns than it did to the Europe's, as it was in the small libraries. The findings for the large library did lead to a few interesting observations. So, unlike the previous data sets, where I had unlike in the previous data sets where I had more high acceptance cities than low acceptance cities, here is the inverse. When looking at the cookbooks as a percentage of the collection size, we see that cities with higher acceptance generally lead, although Austin, Texas and Phoenix, Arizona both have a higher percentage than Salt Lake County. When going to look at the regions, we see when we look at the cookbooks by the regional cookbooks, we see that the America region is still highly favored, with the food allergy and removal being the second most, pushing the Europe region clearly into the third. Although here we actually also finally see the numbers for the Asia really climb up into near parity with the Europe region. So one potential issue that I think is occurring in this is the fact that economies of scale are coming into play, and that is suppressing down the differences. So where the clear distinction in the small and medium-sized libraries that appeared visible don't appear as readily because of the larger budgets. Although if we compare Columbus, Ohio and Phoenix, Texas, which have a similar collection and annual circulation size, we do see that the hypothesis still holds true. Moving on to validity challenges. There were several here I feel I need to highlight. First, community informatics uses publicly available information, so data misalignments are extremely common, such as the naturalization rate, which is not an acceptance, but a processing of an application to become a citizen. I also had an over-reliance on search terms and recent site-promoted articles, and not using more examples from the websites, both of which had some extensive lists, but I used recent articles to reduce the number of libraries. Inconsistent local or main branch search results, as well as differing discovery layers giving irregular results, made it very difficult to do a side-by-side comparison. Also, I feel by grouping only by the city population size, I may have missed several comparisons to strengthen the paradigm. The last two, I believe, are the most paramount. The unbalanced comparisons between the groupings of having only one or two comparisons against the majority of the unbalanced comparisons between the groupings meant that there was only one or two high acceptance or low acceptance in each group, thereby skewing the results. And lastly, using Wilmer because of my lived experience in the town, I also believe adds a validity issue as well. In conclusion, while I do not believe I was able to prove my hypothesis, I do not believe I was able to disprove it either. While in the smaller libraries, I think the evidence is more readily visible when the library increases size, the trend lines compress into more muddled numbers. I also think that some irreconcilable inconsistencies hampered my finding consistency. And lastly, in the end, I think I might this might have been more than I was originally able to handle with my limited skill set.